So we had a question float by, which actually kind of leads to our next topic, which was how to be on a road trip. Here it is, and make a project from that. Is it possible? I do that constantly, and I know you do too, Dan. Tell us about your experience road tripping and making projects.
Yeah, I mean the classic here in the U.S. anyway. You'll hear a phrase called the classic American road trip, and we are the land of the automobile. We built an interstate highway system decades ago, and so people road trip here as a way of life. And during something like COVID, the road trip world exploded because people weren't getting on planes. It's very, very, very possible to do a project from a road trip. My advice is to come up with a theme before you leave. So driving around and shooting random road trip photographs, I've never done that because it doesn't appeal to me. I'm not into the random aspects of it. Even though this summer alone, I drove 12,000 miles through 25 American states, and I went from Seattle on the West Coast to Maine on the East Coast. But I have themes that I'm implementing the entire way. And those themes can be very intricate or they can be very simple. It could be a series as simple as doing a portrait series where you're asking every person you encounter the same question and then making a portrait. You could be looking for objects of a certain color palette that are then allowing you to link. Even though you're randomly exploring the country, you're able to have this one very narrow color palette that's basically linking all of your photographs together. Anything that provides you a theme to work around will, the first thing it does is it makes you feel like you're making progress. And sometimes when you're on a road trip and you're driving to so many different locations, it can feel very scattered. And oftentimes you look at your work at the end of the day and you go, man, this is just all over the place. But if you've got a theme where you're suddenly looking for a color, a palette of red, and you say, wow, that's the palette I'm looking for. All of a sudden at the end of the day, you're like, okay, I added 2 images to the project. And then the next day, maybe you add an image. And by the time you're gone for 2 or 3 weeks, you've got maybe 20, 30, 40 images that all fit that same theme. Those are tricks to allow yourself to make progress.
Yeah. And for me too, one of the things I do is I go back to an area that I've been to before. That's kind of the story itself. I did that recently. I went back to the Canyonlands in Utah, and I hadn't been there since I was 19. So I wanted to go back and find the exact location of this backpacking trip that I took, and it was like a needle in a haystack, but we found it. And I photographed the whole thing and videoed it, and that can be a cool story because then I could weave in my photographs from many years ago in with the new images, and that's a cool thing. That's why it's so great to go back to places again and again and keep photographing because you're always going to come
Yeah,
up with new stuff.
I'm not one of these people that counts the countries I've been to, or because to me it's like, so what? I've been, stepped foot into El Salvador one day, but did I actually do anything interesting or see the country? No. And so, yeah, can I tell people I went to El Salvador? Sure. Does it matter? No. And so I much prefer to find a story that I like or a people that I like, and I go back over and over and over again. That's why I really looking at the future in terms of my documentary work. New Mexico is really enough for me. There's so much here that I want to do and see. And I find it sometimes odd where I run into photographers here who don't seem to know anything about their local community or or the state itself. I'll mention a place that's 15 minutes from Santa Fe and they're like, never heard of it. So for me, I'd much rather spend the rest of my life working here and building a body of work about New Mexico as much as humanly possible. And so I think shooting the same thing over and over. But here's the real differentiator for me, is when you start to involve people in your projects. It's one thing to photograph random landscapes or urban abstract landscapes, which is very popular now with a certain subset of photographer. Those are what I would call detached photographs. There's no real attachment. You don't need model releases. You don't need to talk to anyone. You don't need access or permission. You're just basically, in urban environments shooting, old cars and all that stuff, which is fine. If you really want to heighten the stakes and you really want to gravitate and elevate yourself as a photographer, start photographing people you don't know. because this in itself is an entire psychological experiment that will constantly turn you inside out in both good and bad ways. It's also a very interesting way of keeping track of the pulse of the culture that you are living in. So, one of the things that I think, if you look at America as a culture right now, we are faltering in ways that are terrifying. And I think one of the reasons we're faltering is we spend so much time online instead of talking to the people who are around us. So, do you know your neighbors? How well
Boy,
do you know what works, what's working in their lives and what's not? And when you start talking to people you don't know and photographing them, your degree of difficulty just went through the roof, but the reward for doing it is so much better than just shooting non-human photographs. It just is. You just don't know what's going to happen, and you will have the best of times and the worst of times, and it teaches you what it means to be a photographer, and also teaches you what other people view you as when you're walking around and identifying yourself as a photographer. That right there will, you'll get it, the full range of reaction from, wow, this is interesting, I think what you're doing is great, to get away from me, don't photograph me,
totally.
you you shouldn't be here. And it just allows you to learn how to navigate the world in a way that is different from people who don't photograph people.
I hear you. Okay, Amy asks a question here. Do you need model releases from everyone you photograph?
It depends on what you want to do with those photographs. If you talk to an attorney who specializes in law related to photography, they will tell you, yes, you need to model release every single identifiable person in every single photograph. Not to mention, you also need location releases, and you may need architectural releases depending on where you are.
Yeah.
And so that sucks all the fun out of it.
No kidding.
And that's one of the reasons I stopped working as a photographer. Was I had already run into legal situations several times, some of which took up multiple years of my life. And I had model releases, and it really didn't matter when it came to going to court or going to trial. Those model releases really didn't hold much water. And so, in talks with lawyers and those types, they were like, look, you should be prepared for litigation for the rest of your career. And I just said, look, it's not something I really want to do. But for most of us, if it depends on what you're doing with the photograph. Are you trying to put it into the world and sell it? Are you on assignment for someone? If you're on assignment for a publication, then yes, you should be model releasing as much as you possibly can. But for most of us, if you're putting images on your website and you're not profiting from these, and it depends also to what country you're in. America is an incredibly litigious culture and society. We sue for sport here. And so, it depends. Other countries are even more demanding when it comes to releases, and other countries that don't bother at all. So it really depends on the usage of the photograph.
We have a question from Nate, and please subscribe and enable the bell so you don't miss any of our new shows. Like the video and please share it and leave your comments. I love hearing from you. And remember to get out and capture your own images of life.